afternoon, everyone. So this is Group One's report, and our topic is all about the colonial modernity and the early period of Philippine contemporary art. So the first topic that we're going to talk about is the Americanization of Filipino culture. So first, the objective of our topic is the student will be able to number one, trace the development of contemporary art in the Philippines. 2. Discuss the factors which led to emergence of contemporary art. 3. Identify and discuss artwork sites and the lens of which exemplify the significant changes in art in the Philippines. Number 4. Discuss the individuals and group that contributed to the development of contemporary art in the country. And the last, identify local art and heritage insights. In the early 90s, public service, health, and education were all geared towards the colonial order's core goal of Americanizing the Philippines. As water tanks, public sanitation, and clean water become increasingly accessible to more people. Pipes, hoses, and sewage systems were built and put into service. There were also printing offices, ice plants, and cold storage facilities contracted by the government. Modernization took place in the sugar, tobacco, hemp, mining, and agricultural industries. The value of import and export between the United States and the Philippines has risen. In 1896, cinema, a technological art from the previous century, had already arrived in the country. The first silent feature films to be exhibited in Manila were Edward Grass' La Vida de Jose Rizal and Albert Yearsley's El Fusilamiento de Dr. Jose Rizal. However, Jose Nepomuceno's Dalagang Bukid, a cinematic adaptation of the Zarzuela by Hermogenes Ilagan and Leon Ignacio, was the first Filipino films to be released in 1990. Miracles of Love in 1926 was produced by Vicente Salombites, a Hollywood-trained director who starred with Hermogenes Ilagan and Dimples Cooper, with Jose Nepomuceno manning the camera. The first film with recorded sound was George Moser's Ang Aswang in 1932, Carlos Vander Tolosa's Diwatang Karagatan in 1936, and Tor Villano's Ligaw na Bituin in 1938. Although radio transmission and broadcast were believed to have begun in Manila in 1922 and Cebu in 1929, the first commercial radio station in the Philippines, KZRH or now DZRH, was not established until 1939. Radio was a game-changing invention in the early 20th century. The wireless radio became a necessary consumer item and eventually a stylish piece of domestic furniture in the 1930s. Thanks to an increase in the usage of the new medium, Huling-Habilins ang among the period cinematic highlights in 1939. Originally, programming was based on the American format, and the majority of early practitioners were American artists and engineers. Everyday speech from both coasts of the American continent had become audible as idiom and humors in the tropics, therefore English had to be the language of transmission. Listeners in the Philippines were exposed to jazz, blues, and nearly every other musical style that helped the American songbook become a popular art form thanks to radio. With Filipino talents serving as masters of ceremonies and commentators, the sound became instantly local. Classical vocalist Dalisay Aldaba and Enya Gonzalez, as well as musicians Ariston Aguilino and Rafael Artigas, performed on radio programs. Audiences, on the other hand, favored singers who emulated American timbre and language, such as Ding Yalong, dubbed the Philippines being crossed by, and Francisco Trinidad dubbed the Philippines Lake Power. The walled city or Intramuros was opened and expanded when the Ayuntamiento was turned into the municipio, with new roads and bridges created. Daniel Burham planned the city of Manila, balancing tradition and nature preservation while modernizing it with a grid system of streets between two main wide boulevards. One is the Dewey, or now the Rojas Boulevard, and Taft Avenue with a collection of government buildings centered on a central forum, the Luneta or Historical Park. Parkways were built along the coastline of Cavite and Pasig River as a part of proposed. Burnham influenced the design of buildings and urban planning in the United States, following in the footsteps of the City Beautiful movement and establishing neoclassical architecture as a design and construction paradigm. While he created the plan, his successor, William Parson, who worked as the Bureau of Public Works consulting architect from 1905 to 1914, designed and built the majority of the structures.
By 1941, at the start of World War II, the Americans had accomplished much of what they set out to do when they first arrived in the Philippines. When we talk about cultural infrastructure, we mean the buildings, structures, and spaces where cultural is consumed, places where culture is experienced, participated in, showcased, exhibited, or sold, for example, museums, galleries, theaters, cinemas, libraries, record stores, and historical cultural sites. The infrastructure cultural change. The Bureau of Public Work was established by the American colonial bureaucracy to oversee all the state-sponsored infrastructure projects. Manila spawned a slew of new government structures under the Bureau's auspice, including public school buildings, sanitariums, university, city halls, municipal hospitals, and a host of other public structures. Modern materials such as reinforced concrete, plate glass, concrete hollow blocks, and steel became widely available to support this infrastructure agenda. By the late 1920s and 30s, a monumental neoclassical style became popular as reflected in the last of the major public buildings to be built along the Taft Avenue, following Burnham's plan. This included the Central Post Office of the Head the Avenue Plaza Lawton, the Legislature Building with its classic brick pediments, and a twin finance and agricultural buildings now part of the National Museum complex. A number of master Filipino architects like Juan Arellano, who designed several of these imposing edifices, were part of the first generation of local architects to train in the United States. In every provincial urban centers, neoclassical capitol buildings rose as the embodiment of the American Republic ideals. The processes of democratic apprenticeship were demonstrated by the Americans to their Filipino colonial subjects through this style. A grand frontage with a series of Greek or Roman columns, entablature, and pediments, as well as wide, tall windows all over, to let in the natural light and ventilation, characterizes the architectural style. Antonio Toledo's Manila City Hall, tourism, financial buildings, and Juan Arellano's design for legislative buildings and Manila Central Post Office are excellent examples. Soon after, town planning began in the provinces primarily by Filipino architects and engineers. In places like Lingaye, Ifugao, Batangas, Sorsogon, Masbate, Iloilo, Cebu, Capiz, Cotabato, Bukidnon, and Zamboanga. Pensionados were sent in the United States for advanced studies. Gabaldon's schoolhouses, designed by Parsons with appropriate tropical designs, were built in the Philippines. The University of the Philippines in Manila was founded in 1908, and the University of the Philippines in Cebu was founded in 1918. By the late 1920s and 30s, a monumental neoclassical style became popular as reflected in the last of the major public buildings to be built along the Taft Avenue following Bertham's plan. This included the central post office of the Avenue Plaza Lawton, the legislature building with its classic brick pediments, and a twin finance and agricultural buildings now part of the National Museum complex. A number of master Filipino architects like Juan Arellano, who designed several of these imposing edifices, were part of the first generation of local architects to train in the United States.
Art Deco, also called Style Modern, movement in the decorative arts and architecture that originated in the 1920s and developed into a major style in Western Europe and the United States during the 1930s. Its name was derived from the exposition International des Arts, Decoratives and Industrials Moderns, held in Paris in 1925, where the style was first exhibited. Art Deco design represented modernism turned into fashion, and products included both individually crafted luxury items, mass-produced wares, but in either case, the intention was to create a sleek and anti-traditional elegance that symbolized wealth and sophistication. So let's talk about the characteristic Filipino art deco. The style used linear motifs, thick geometrical patterns, and zigzags meant to represent the 1920s to 1930s fashion age. The movement reached the shores of the Philippines in the 1930s. Local artists like Juan Nakpil, Andres Luna de San Pedro, and Juan Arellano are some of the most prominent Art Deco artists. So the question is, who brought Art Deco in the Philippines? And to answer that question, American and European educated Filipino architects such as Pablo Antonio, Juan Arellano, Thomas Mapua, Juan Nakpil, and Fernando Campo played a place in modernizing and rebuilding the Filipino architectural landscape with Art Deco inspired residences and public buildings all over the country. Art Deco was the architectural and stylistical sensation of the 20th century, originating in France and spread across cities and towns around the world, and reached the Philippines via the United States, where it flourished during the Commonwealth era. The Philippines saw exception in the flourishing of Art Deco architecture during the rise of the cinema in the Philippines as a form of recreation. Several theaters were built in the 1930s and 1950s in the Art Deco style. These were designed by prominent architects of the time and included architects no other than Pablo Antonio, Juan Arellano, and the Philippines National Artist for architecture, Juan Nakpil. These architects contributed to the designs of the classic Philippines theater. The most famous Art Deco theater in the Philippines is the Manila Metropolitan Theater, which provided the venue of early forms of entertainment like vaudeville, a local adaptation of vaudeville with most of eventually converting to a movie. Theaters with growth and popularity of cinema in our country. Art Deco. Did you know that Art Deco emerged from the heady years of the 1920s when the modernist movement was starting to make inroads on previous historical revivalist styles? We saw the movement reach Philippine shores in the 1930s with a slew of new buildings designed by Juan Arellano, Juan Napil, Andres Lona de San Pedro, and others. By the end of 19th century in France, many of the notable artists, architects, and designers who had played important roles in the development of art Novius time recognized that it was becoming increasingly passe. At the close of a century that saw the Industrial Revolution take hold, contemporary life became very different from a few decades earlier. It was time for something new, something that would shout 20th century from tasteful modernist rooftops. Art Deco represented a commitment to technological progress, featured radically simplified forms, rationality, and functionality. It impacted architecture as a surface element of decorative forms and motifs. Art Deco works are symmetrical, geometric, streamlined, often simple, and pleasing to the eye. And to give you an example of the popular Art Deco buildings in the Philippines include the Capitol Theater by Juan Nakpil, the First United Building by Andres Luna San Pedro, and the Far Eastern University Main Building by Pablo Antonio